Imagine a clay tablet, no bigger than your hand, buried beneath desert sand for 4,000 years. The cuneiform pressed into its surface tells a story. 2 brothers, one a farmer, one a shepherd. A divine choice is made. One brother is favoured, the other is rejected. Death follows. Sound familiar? Now here's the thing that should make you sit up. This tablet was written at least 1,000 years before the Bible existed. Maybe 2,000 years before. The story of Cain and Abel. The first murder. The first act of jealousy between brothers. It's in Genesis. Everyone knows it. But what if I told you that story's an echo? What if the original voice came from somewhere else entirely, from a civilization most people have never heard of, speaking a language that was already dead when Abraham was born? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments. It's like Tokyo at midnight, London at lunch, all existing in the same moment. The story we're about to explore sits in that haunting space between myth and history, between what we know and what we suspect. Because here's what we know for certain. In ancient Sumer, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, scribes were pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, creating the oldest written stories humanity has ever found. And buried in those texts is a narrative that will sound shockingly, impossibly familiar. 2 men, Dumuzi and Enkimdu, a shepherd and a farmer, both competing for the love of the goddess Inanna. She must choose between them. One will be favoured, one will be rejected, and the rejected one, his fate becomes tangled with death, with the underworld, with a darkness that echoes forward through thousands of years. The parallels aren't subtle, they're striking, almost disturbing in their similarity. But here's where it gets really interesting. These Sumerian texts weren't discovered until the 1800s. For thousands of years they sat beneath the sand waiting. Nobody in the ancient world after Sumer fell could read cuneiform anymore. The language died. The stories were forgotten. And yet somehow, the structure of these narratives, the archetypes, the moral framework, they show up again. In Babylon, in Canaan, eventually in Hebrew scripture. So what are we looking at? Direct transmission? Did the ancient Hebrews know these Sumerian stories and adapt them? Or is this something stranger, something deeper? Are these the kind of stories that humans tell themselves over and over because they touch something fundamental about who we are? The rivalry between ways of life, the pain of divine rejection, the violence that erupts when someone feels unseen by the gods. The academics have been arguing about this for over a century. Some see clear lines of cultural transmission, stories travelling along trade routes and through conquering armies, mutating slightly with each retelling but keeping their essential shape. Others see parallel development, different cultures wrestling with the same human questions and arriving at similar narrative answers. But what nobody disputes anymore is this. The Sumerian versions are older, definitively, provably older. Which means at minimum we need to rethink what we thought we knew about where these stories come from. Over the next hours we're going to read what the actual tablets say. Not summaries, not interpretations, but the words themselves, translated from cuneiform. We're going to explore the linguistic mysteries, the names that might connect across languages and millennia. We're going to look at the archaeological evidence, the theoretical frameworks, and yes, the wild possibilities that exist in the margins of academic consensus. This isn't about proving the Bible wrong or right. It's about something more fascinating. It's about watching a story emerge from the darkness of deep time, seeing how it transforms and travels, understanding that the tales we think we know might have roots reaching back further than we ever imagined, back to the very beginning of writing itself, to clay tablets pressed by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago. The story starts in Sumer. but really it starts even before that, in the space before writing, where stories lived only in voices that are now forever silent. Picture the world's first family in the aftermath of Paradise Lost. Adam and Eve, exiled from the Garden of Eden, standing at the edge of a world that was suddenly hostile, suddenly difficult, suddenly demanding labour just to survive. The Bible tells us that Eve bore 2 sons. The first she named Cain, a name that might mean acquired or forged, as if to say, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. The second she named Abel, which in Hebrew is HEVEL, meaning breath or vapour. Something transient, something fleeting. Already in their very names there's a shadow of what's coming. The story most of us know is deceptively simple. Just 16 verses in Genesis chapter 4. But packed into those verses is something that has haunted human imagination for millennia. Cain became a tiller of the ground, a farmer, working the cursed soil that would now resist human effort, yield its fruit grudgingly. Abel became a keeper of sheep, a shepherd, wandering with his flocks, living a more mobile existence under open skies. 2 brothers, 2 professions, 2 ways of wresting survival from a world that no longer gave freely. Then comes the moment that changes everything. In the course of time, the Bible says, both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain brought the fruit of the ground. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, their fat portions. The text is specific about Abel's offering. Firstborn, the best. But about Cain's offering, there's only the vague description, fruit of the ground. Not the first fruits, not the best, just fruit. Maybe this matters, maybe it doesn't. The Bible doesn't actually say. What the Bible does say is that God had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard, no explanation, no divine pronouncement about why one was acceptable and the other wasn't. Just rejection, stark and absolute. And Cain's response is immediate and visceral. The text tells us he was very angry and his face fell. This is the first recorded human emotion after the expulsion from Eden. Not joy, not wonder at the new world, not even the fear Adam and Eve must have felt when the angel's flaming sword barred their return. Just anger, raw, humiliated, burning anger at divine rejection. God notices. God always notices in these stories. And here's where the narrative becomes almost unbearably intimate. The Lord asks Cain directly, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." Think about that image for a moment. Sin personified as a predator crouching like a lion at the threshold waiting to spring. This is the first time the word sin appears in the Bible. Not in the garden with the fruit and the serpent. Here, now, in the heart of a rejected son nursing his wounded pride. What happens next is told with brutal economy. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. That's it. No description of the method, no lengthy explanation of how the anger built or what final words were exchanged. Just the terrible fact. The first human born from a woman becomes the first murderer. The second human born becomes the first corpse. Blood spilled into soil that was already cursed. Violence erupting into a world barely begun. The Lord's response mirrors the interrogation in the garden. "Where is Abel your brother?" God asks, knowing perfectly well where Abel is. And Cain's answer has echoed through every courtroom and every confession for thousands of years. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It's deflection. It's sarcasm. It's a man refusing to accept what he's done, even as the evidence literally soaks into the ground beneath his feet. And God's reply is devastating. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." This is poetry. Tragic, haunting poetry. The blood itself has a voice. The murdered victim cries out from the earth for justice, and the curse that follows is specifically tailored to Cain's crime. You are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The farmer who killed his shepherd brother is condemned to never successfully farm again. The man who worked the soil will be rejected by the soil itself. It's divine irony of the most terrible kind. Cain's response is fascinating. He doesn't deny his guilt. He doesn't ask forgiveness. Instead, he complains about the punishment. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. There's real fear here. But notice what he fears. Not divine judgment, not the weight of fratricide on his soul. He fears human revenge. He fears other people finding him and doing to him what he did to Abel. Which raises one of the first great mysteries the story leaves dangling. Who are these other people Cain is afraid of? The Bible has mentioned exactly 4 humans at this point: Adam, Eve, Cain, and the now dead Abel. So who else is out there? Who are these potential avengers? The traditional explanation is that Adam and Eve had other children, daughters and sons not named in the text, and that Cain feared his own siblings. But the narrative doesn't clarify. It just lets the question hang there, opening a space for thousands of years of speculation and interpretation. God's response to Cain's fear is equally mysterious. The Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. And the Lord said, "If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. The mark of Cain. Countless sermons, novels, films, and theological treatises have speculated about what this mark was. A physical brand, a spiritual aura, a changed appearance. The text doesn't say. It only tells us its purpose: protection. The first murderer is marked not for condemnation, but for preservation. God himself becomes Cain's protector, warning off anyone who might seek revenge. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The land of Nod, the land of wandering. Even the name emphasizes his curse. He's condemned to wander, and he settles in the land named for wandering itself. There, the text tells us, Cain knew his wife. Again, the mystery. Where did this wife come from? Who was she? The Bible offers no explanation. Cain builds a city. He has descendants who become the fathers of tent dwellers, livestock keepers, musicians, metal workers. The line of the first murderer becomes the line of civilization's inventors. It's almost as if violence and culture are intertwined from the very beginning of human story. But let's step back from the narrative and ask the big question. Why has this story captivated humanity for millennia? Why do we keep returning to these 16 verses, finding in them mirrors for our own struggles, our own violence, our own questions about fairness and divine favor? Part of it is the universality of the themes. Sibling rivalry exists in every culture. The question of why bad things happen to good people, why some prosper while others struggle doing seemingly the same things, these are eternal human concerns. The story of Cain and Abel distills them to their essence. But there's something else. Something the Bible deliberately leaves unanswered. Why did God reject Cain's offering? Thousands of years of commentary have tried to fill this gap. Maybe Cain's heart wasn't right. Maybe his offering wasn't his best. Maybe God simply preferred blood sacrifice to grain offerings, establishing a pattern that would continue throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Maybe, some scholars suggest, it was arbitrary, a test of how Cain would respond to unexplained rejection. The text gives us no certainty, only the fact of rejection, and its catastrophic consequence. This ambiguity is powerful. It forces every reader to confront the possibility that life isn't always fair, that divine favour isn't always explicable, that sometimes we face rejection through no fault we can identify. And then it asks us, what will you do with that anger? When sin crouches at your door, when rage and humiliation threaten to consume you, will you master it? Or will you, like Cain, let it master you? The story also leaves unanswered what Abel thought, what Abel felt, what Abel might have said if given a chance to speak. He's voiceless except for his blood crying from the ground. The first victim, the first of countless humans whose lives would be cut short by violence, remembered primarily through the harm done to them rather than the lives they lived. There's something deeply tragic about Abel's silence in the narrative. He brings his offering, it's accepted, then he's murdered. He never gets to enjoy his divine favour. He never gets to build a family or a city or contribute to civilization like his brother's descendants do. He's just gone. Breath, vapour, HEVEL. And finally, there's the question of Cain's ultimate fate. The Bible tells us he wandered, he married, he built, he fathered a line of descendants. But did he ever find peace? Did the ground ever stop rejecting him? Did he ever reconcile with God, with himself, with the memory of his brother? The text doesn't say. It moves on to other stories, other generations. Cain disappears from the narrative, condemned to wander not just geographically, but through history itself, his name becoming synonymous with fratricide, his mark a symbol of both guilt and mysterious divine protection. This is the story as the Bible tells it, spare, haunting, deliberately incomplete. But here's what makes it even more fascinating. This wasn't the first time this story was told, not even close. Thousands of years before the Hebrew scribes recorded Genesis, another version of this tale was being inscribed on clay tablets in the cities of ancient Sumer, a story of two rivals, a farmer and a shepherd, competing for divine favour. And when we examine those older texts, when we trace the lineages of these competing stories, we discover something remarkable. The tale of Cain and Abel might be far more ancient, far more complex, and far more connected to other mythologies than traditional interpretation has ever suggested. Imagine being the first person in over 2,000 years to read a story that everyone thought was lost forever. Now imagine discovering that this ancient story sounds disturbingly familiar, like something you learned in Sunday school as a child, except it's older. Much older. Older than the Bible itself. This is exactly what happened in the mid-1800s when European archaeologists began digging into the buried cities of ancient Mesopotamia. They weren't looking for biblical parallels. Most of them were looking for treasure, or glory, or just trying to confirm that the places mentioned in the Bible had actually existed. What they found instead changed everything we thought we knew about the origins of Western civilization. The first hints came in the 1840s when French and British excavators started pulling massive stone sculptures out of the Iraqi desert. Winged bulls with human heads, palace walls covered in strange wedge-shaped writing, entire cities that had been buried under centuries of sand and silt. But these weren't the cities anyone expected. The inscriptions weren't in Hebrew or any language scholars recognized. They were in something older, something that predated the biblical civilizations by thousands of years. By the 1850s, archaeologists had identified these ruins as belonging to the Assyrians and Babylonians, great empires that had dominated the ancient Near East. But as they dug deeper, literally and chronologically, they found something underneath those civilizations. Earlier ruins, older pottery, strange clay tablets covered in writing that was clearly more primitive than the Babylonian cuneiform they were starting to decipher. They had discovered the Sumerians, and nobody had any idea who these people were. The Sumerians weren't mentioned in the Bible. They weren't discussed in any Greek or Roman texts. They had been so completely forgotten that even their name had vanished from human memory. But the archaeological evidence was overwhelming. These people had built the first cities in human history, cities like Uruk and Ur and Nippur, sprawling urban centres with tens of thousands of inhabitants, while most of the world was still living in scattered villages. More importantly, the Sumerians had invented writing itself. Around 3400 BCE, in the city of Uruk in what is now southern Iraq, someone made a revolutionary discovery. They figured out that you could press a reed stylus into wet clay to make marks, and those marks could represent not just pictures of things, but sounds, ideas, abstract concepts. This wasn't the first attempt at symbolic communication. Humans had been drawing pictures for tens of thousands of years. But this was different. This was systematic. This was a technology that could be taught, standardized, improved over generations. The earliest tablets are basically accounting records. How much grain in the temple storehouse? How many sheep belonging to which official? Boring stuff, but revolutionary boring stuff, because it meant humans no longer had to rely entirely on memory. Knowledge could be preserved, transferred, accumulated in ways that had never been possible before. But here's where it gets interesting for our story. Within a few hundred years, the Sumerians weren't just using writing for accounting. They were using it to record everything: medical texts, legal codes, letters between lovers, and most importantly for us, they were writing down their stories, their myths, their religious texts, their explanations for how the world worked and why things were the way they were. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian scribes were recording elaborate mythological cycles on clay tablets, stories about their gods and heroes, tales of creation and destruction, myths explaining agriculture, crafts, natural disasters. These tablets were stored in temple libraries and palace archives, thousands upon thousands of them, baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun, or sometimes by the fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them. When those cities fell, when empires collapsed and populations scattered, the tablets were buried under the rubble, and there they stayed for millennia, preserved by the dry Iraqi soil, waiting to tell their stories to anyone who could learn to read them again. The problem was, nobody could. When European archaeologists started recovering these tablets in the 1850s and 60s, they faced an almost impossible challenge. Sumerian was a language isolate, unrelated to any known language family. It had no living descendants. No Sumerian Rosetta Stone existed to provide a bilingual translation. The script itself was maddeningly complex, with hundreds of signs that could represent syllables, whole words, or abstract concepts depending on context. But scholars are persistent, and they had thousands of tablets to work with. Slowly, painstakingly, using Akkadian and Babylonian texts that had Sumerian glosses, comparing similar passages across multiple tablets, working through endless lists and lexicons that ancient scribes had compiled, they began to crack the code. By the 1890s, Sumerian could be read again. Not perfectly, not without debates and disagreements, but well enough that the meaning of texts was becoming clear. And what they found was shocking. The Sumerians had a flood story. A righteous man warned by the gods to build a boat and save the animals, waters covering the earth. A bird sent out to search for dry land. The parallels to Noah were impossible to ignore. They had a creation story involving gods shaping humans from clay. They had stories about the first cities, the first kings, the invention of agriculture and civilization. They had myths about paradise gardens and divine judgments, and humanity's fall from grace. And they had a story about two brothers, one a farmer, one a shepherd, both competing for divine favour, both making offerings to the gods, one accepted, one rejected. conflict arising from that rejection. The implications were staggering. The Bible, which Western civilization had treated as the oldest and most original source of these stories, clearly wasn't the original at all. These Sumerian texts predated the biblical narratives by over 1,000 years, sometimes 2,000. The stories that millions of people had grown up believing were unique. Divine revelations were actually part of a much older tradition, a common pool of ancient Near Eastern mythology that different cultures had adapted and transmitted across millennia. Some scholars were horrified, others were fascinated. But everyone realized that understanding biblical stories now required understanding their Sumerian predecessors. You couldn't talk about Cain and Abel without first understanding what the Sumerians had written about farmers and shepherds, about divine favor and human jealousy, about the fundamental tensions that arose when humanity first abandoned the nomadic life and settled down to farm. The tablets holding these secrets were waiting, clay voices from 4,000 years ago, ready to tell their version of a story we thought we already knew. Before there was Cain and Abel, before Genesis was ever written down, there was another story. A story about a shepherd and a farmer competing for divine favor. But this tale wasn't preserved in Hebrew. It was pressed into wet clay in a language most people have never heard of, in a land that had already been ruins for thousands of years when the Bible was compiled. The Sumerians called him Dumuzi. In their language his name meant faithful son or true son of the waters. He was a shepherd, a keeper of flocks, and in the oldest version of his story, he was competing for something precious. Not just his life, but the love of a goddess. His rival was Enkimdu, a farmer, a cultivator of grain, a man whose hands knew the soil instead of the wool, and between them stood Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, the queen of heaven. She had to choose. Now, if you're thinking this sounds familiar, you're not wrong. A shepherd and a farmer, divine favor hanging in the balance, competition that would end in tragedy. But here's what makes this remarkable. The Sumerian tablets containing this story date back to at least 2100 BCE, possibly earlier. Some fragments might be even older, preserved in the oral traditions that preceded writing. Genesis, in its written form, probably wasn't compiled until around 1000 BCE at the earliest, possibly much later. That's a minimum gap of 1000 years, a millennium of separation between these two tales. The Sumerian scribes who first pressed this story into clay were recording something already ancient to them, something that had been told and retold around fires, in temple courtyards, at festivals and funerals. They were capturing in cuneiform a narrative that spoke to something fundamental about their world. Let's look at what the tablets actually say. The story begins with Inanna, young and radiant, standing at a crossroads. Her brother Utu, the sun god, urges her to marry Dumuzi the shepherd. But Inanna hesitates. She's drawn to Enkimdu instead, the farmer with his fields of grain, his orchards heavy with fruit, his gardens blooming with vegetables and flax. The farmer, she tells Utu. I will marry the farmer who makes plants grow abundantly, the farmer who makes grain grow abundantly. There's something in her words that reveal a preference for stability, for the settled life of agriculture. Grain stores can last through winter, orchards stay rooted in one place, gardens can be defended, controlled, predicted. The farmer represents permanence in a world where permanence was precious. But Dumuzi objects. He won't accept rejection quietly. In the tablets, he confronts Enkimdu directly, challenging the farmer's worth. What does the farmer have that I don't have? If he gives you black garments, I'll give you white ones. If he gives you grain, I'll give you fine wool. If he pours you beer, I'll pour you sweet milk. It's competitive, certainly. But notice something important. This isn't violence yet. It's rivalry, argument, persuasion. Dumuzi is trying to win through comparison, through demonstrating his value. He's listing the gifts of pastoral life against agricultural abundance. Milk versus beer, wool versus linen, the mobility and protein-rich diet of herding versus the carbohydrate security of farming. Enkimdu, for his part, doesn't escalate. In fact, in most versions of the text he backs down. He acknowledges Dumuzi's status, recognizes his connection to the divine, and essentially concedes the competition. "Why should I compete with you?" he asks. "Your sheep can graze in my fields. Your flocks can drink from my canals. In Uruk, my city and yours, farmer and shepherd, can live in peace." It's a remarkable moment. The farmer offering compromise, suggesting cooperation instead of conflict. Agriculture and pastoralism need not be enemies. They can coexist, even support each other. Sheep fertilize fields. Farmers provide stubble for grazing. The two ways of life can be complementary rather than competitive. And in this version of the story, Inanna chooses Dumuzi, not because he destroyed his rival, but because he argued his case effectively, and because Enkimdu graciously stepped aside. The goddess of love chooses a shepherd, and the story moves forward into different tragedies that we'll explore later. But for now, focus on this resolution. Competition resolved through negotiation rather than murder. This is profoundly different from the Cain and Abel narrative. In Genesis, God's preference for Abel's offering creates a division that can't be bridged. Cain's rage builds until it explodes in murder. There's no negotiation, no compromise, just rejection, fury, and blood on the ground. But the underlying tension is identical. Shepherd versus farmer, pastoral versus agricultural, mobile versus settled. And both stories recognize that this tension carried weight that transcended individual relationships. This wasn't just about two men or two professions. It was about two entire ways of organizing human society. Think about what was at stake in the ancient world. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had been mobile, hunter-gatherers, following game and seasonal plants. Even after the agricultural revolution, pastoralism represented a middle path. Shepherds were settled enough to manage breeding, mobile enough to follow grass and water. They lived between two worlds. Farmers were different. Agriculture meant commitment. You plant in one place, you stay in that place. You build permanent structures, dig irrigation channels, mark out property boundaries. You develop concepts of land ownership that would have been meaningless to earlier humans. This land is mine. That field belongs to my family. These boundaries are sacred. And when pastoralists moved their flocks across those boundaries, conflict was inevitable. When sheep grazed fields that farmers had claimed, when shepherds drew water from wells that agricultural communities had dug, tensions rose. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Some of the earliest evidence of organized violence comes from the periods when farming and herding communities began competing for the same territories. The Sumerians knew this intimately. Their civilization was built on agriculture, on the grain surplus that fed their cities and funded their temples. But they were surrounded by pastoral peoples, nomadic herders who moved through the edges of their territory, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding. The relationship was complex, often hostile, occasionally cooperative. So when they told stories about Dumuzi and Enkimdu, they were processing real social tensions, working through actual conflicts that shaped their daily lives. And when Hebrew scribes centuries later told a similar story about Cain and Abel, they were drawing on this same deep well of cultural memory, responding to the same fundamental question that had troubled human societies since the first seeds were planted. How do we live together when our survival strategies are fundamentally different? Let's talk about what the tablets actually say. Not scholarly interpretations, not religious commentary, just the words that Sumerian scribes pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago. Words that sat buried in the ruins of ancient temples and libraries until archaeologists pulled them from the earth and began the painstaking work of translation. The story begins with Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She's one of the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon, and she's looking for a husband. Two suitors present themselves, Enkimdu the farmer and Dumuzi the shepherd. Right away, you should be noticing something. This is the setup, the exact same dynamic that appears centuries later in Genesis with Cain and Abel. Farmer versus shepherd, competing for divine favour. But here's where things get interesting. The Sumerian version doesn't start with violence. It starts with an argument, a debate about which lifestyle, which profession, which way of living is more worthy. The text we have comes from multiple tablets, fragments really, discovered at different archaeological sites across ancient Mesopotamia. Ur, Nippur, Uruk. The tablets don't all tell exactly the same version. There are variations, missing sections, parts where the clay has crumbled away, or the text is too damaged to read. But the core story remains consistent across all versions. In the earliest part of the tale, Inanna's brother, the sun god Utu, encourages her to marry the shepherd Dumuzi, but Inanna refuses. She makes her preference clear. She wants the farmer. The text preserves her words, and they're surprisingly specific about why she prefers Enkimdu. The farmer offers stability, permanence. He works the land, produces grain, builds structures that last. The farmer represents civilization in its most literal form, settled agriculture, the foundation of cities, the thing that made Sumer possible in the first place. Listen to how one tablet records her response. The farmer, he makes the grain grow tall. The farmer, he makes the orchards flourish. The farmer brings me bread and beer. Why would I want a shepherd? It's practical reasoning. The farmer produces the staples of Sumerian life. Barley for bread and beer, flax for clothing, established fields that don't require constant movement. From Inanna's perspective, this is obviously the better choice. But Dumuzi doesn't accept rejection quietly. He launches into what might be the oldest recorded sales pitch in human history, a passionate defense of the shepherd's way of life. And here's where the Sumerian text becomes fascinating, because Dumuzi doesn't argue that shepherds are better than farmers. He argues that shepherds provide everything farmers do, plus more. His argument is preserved across several tablet fragments, and it's remarkably detailed. The shepherd says, "I give you milk, fresh and sweet. I give you cheese that doesn't spoil. I give you butter and cream. I give you wool for clothing, finer and warmer than linen. I give you meat for festivals. I give you leather for sandals and bags and tents." Then he goes further. "My flocks move with the seasons, following the best grazing. I know every water source, every safe path through the wilderness. I can take you places the farmer never sees, show you lands beyond the fields. The farmer is tied to one place. I am free." It's poetry, essentially. A romantic vision of pastoral life as not just economically valuable, but spiritually superior. Freedom versus constraint, movement versus stagnation, the wild versus the domesticated. And apparently it works. Inanna changes her mind. The tablets record her acceptance of Dumuzi as her husband, her acknowledgement that the shepherd's gifts are worthy after all. But here's what makes this so different from the biblical story. Enkimdu doesn't rage. He doesn't murder his rival. He doesn't even really protest. Instead, the farmer gracefully accepts the decision. One tablet preserves an exchange between Dumuzi and Enkimdu after Inanna has made her choice. Dumuzi, perhaps feeling magnanimous in victory, offers peace. The two men work out an arrangement. The shepherd's flocks can graze on the farmer's land after harvest, eating the stubble and fertilizing the fields for next season. The farmer's irrigation channels will provide water for the flocks during dry months. They will cooperate. They will both prosper. This is the resolution. Not violence, but accommodation. Not murder, but mutual benefit. The tablets describe a world where farmer and shepherd need each other, where their different ways of life are complementary rather than contradictory. It's a vision of social harmony that sits in stark contrast to what comes later in Genesis. But we have to be careful here. What survives is not necessarily everything that once existed. The tablets we have are copies of copies, texts that were considered important enough to preserve in temple libraries and scribal schools. They represent official versions, stories, that conveyed approved messages about cooperation and social order. Sumerian culture valued these themes highly. Their entire civilization depended on different groups: farmers, shepherds, fishermen, craftsmen, priests, working together in complex economic systems. So the question becomes, was there another version? A darker telling where the competition between farmer and shepherd ended not in peaceful arrangement but in bloodshed? Some scholars think yes. They point to fragmentary references in other Sumerian texts, brief mentions of conflict between Dumuzi and Enkimdu that don't appear in the courtship story as we have it. They note that ancient literature often had multiple versions of the same tale, some for public religious festivals, others for private or esoteric contexts. There's also the fact that the Dumuzi story doesn't end happily. In other Sumerian texts, Dumuzi dies violently, betrayed and hunted, fleeing for his life before being dragged to the underworld. His death becomes the subject of elaborate laments, poems of mourning that were performed annually in Sumerian temples. So violence is definitely part of the larger mythological cycle surrounding these characters. It's just not in the courtship story, at least not in the versions that survived. What the language itself reveals is equally interesting. The Sumerian text uses specific vocabulary for the farmer's work and the shepherd's work. Technical terms for agricultural tools, for different types of grain, for seasonal planting cycles. Equally technical terms for animal husbandry, for pasture management, for dairy production. This isn't mythology in the sense of vague symbolic storytelling. These are texts that reflect deep practical knowledge of both lifestyles. The debate between Dumuzi and Enkimdu reads less like a creation myth and more like a formalized version of arguments that probably happened in every Sumerian city. Real tensions between groups whose economic interests sometimes aligned and sometimes conflicted. The tablets preserve those tensions, but they also preserve a cultural ideal, the belief that different ways of life should compete through persuasion and negotiation, not violence. That even when one path is chosen over another, the losing side has value and deserves respect. Whether that ideal reflected reality or simply represented hope is harder to say, but it's there in the text, pressed into clay, preserved for millennia, waiting to complicate our understanding of where the Cain and Abel story really came from. When we last saw Dumuzi, he was competing with the farmer Enkimdu for the love of Inanna. It was playful, almost light-hearted. A shepherd boasting about his flocks, a farmer defending his fields. No blood, no murder, no curse from the gods. But Sumerian stories rarely stay simple. Because Inanna, the brilliant, dangerous goddess of love and war, didn't just rule romance and fertility, she also had a shadow, and that shadow led straight down into the underworld. In one of the oldest myths we have, Inanna decides to descend to the land of the dead. The tablets don't tell us exactly why in any single tidy explanation. Some say she went to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Others hint she wanted more power, to extend her rule from the heavens above to the darkness below. Whatever the reason, the story agrees on one thing. It was a terrible idea. As she travels down through 7 gates, she's stripped of her clothing, her jewels, her symbols of authority. At each gate she loses another layer of power, until she stands naked and bowed before the judges of the dead. Then something happens that the scribes describe in simple, chilling lines. The judges fix their gaze on her, They speak a word against her, and Inanna dies, the goddess of love, life, fertility, cut down in the realm of no return. But the universe can't survive without her. Grain withers, couples stop conceiving. The flow of life itself starts to falter. So the gods intervene, they send help, and after a series of bargains and negotiations, Inanna is allowed to return to the world of the living. There's a catch. No one leaves the underworld for free. A life has to be exchanged for a life. If Inanna goes back up, someone else has to go down in her place. This is where Dumuzi's story turns dark. When Inanna rises again, she passes through her cities. Everyone she meets is mourning her absence, tearing their hair, sitting in dust and ashes. They're devastated. They love their goddess, and they feared a world without her. To each of these loyal mourners, Inanna shows mercy. She does not mark them for the underworld. Then she comes to her own palace. There, instead of sorrow, instead of grief, she finds Dumuzi, not in sackcloth, not in tears. He's clothed in finery, sitting on a throne, relaxed, almost indifferent. In some versions, he's drinking, feasting, enjoying the pleasures of kingship while the rest of the world thought she was gone forever. This image disturbed ancient listeners. It still feels unsettling now. The beloved shepherd, the chosen husband, apparently unmoved by Inanna's death. So Inanna makes a decision. She points at Dumuzi and says, "In essence, you will take my place." In the myth, she hands him over to the Gala, a terrifying class of underworld demons. They are pitiless, they are relentless, and their mission is simple: drag Dumuzi down. Dumuzi runs. He flees through the countryside, calling on friends, on family, on sympathetic gods and goddesses to hide him. His sister, Inanna, tries to help, offering herself as a substitute, arguing with the forces of the underworld. But the Gala track him like hounds. The text describes them swarming, many and merciless, immune to bribes, tears, or bargains. Eventually they catch him. What happens next is not a gentle passing. The tablets use violent language. Dumuzi is beaten, bound, struck down. His body is broken. In some fragments his blood soaks the ground. The shepherd king, once boasting of his countless sheep and thriving flocks, is reduced to a hunted animal, torn from the world of light and driven into the darkness below. This is not Cain and Abel yet, but listen closely to the echoes. In some strands of the Dumuzi tradition, his brother plays a role in his doom. Later texts hint at betrayal, at family conflict, at another male figure who hands Dumuzi over or fails to protect him. The details are fragmentary, scattered across damaged tablets and overlapping versions, but the outline is there. A brother, a conflict, a death that should not have happened. Brother against brother. In Genesis it's clear. Cain rises up and kills Abel in a field. A farmer murders a shepherd. The Bible tells that story in one brutally simple paragraph. The Sumerians are less direct, but they circle the same pattern. A shepherd favoured by the divine, a violent end, a sense that someone close to him helped bring about his downfall. Is this coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it shows how deeply this kind of story resonated in early societies. Small communities, tight family networks, enormous pressure over land and resources. When violence broke out, it often broke out inside the family, not between strangers. The most shocking murders weren't raids or battles, they were betrayals. Whatever the exact mechanism of Dumuzi's death, demons, divine judgment, hints of human treachery, the emotional aftermath is clear. The ancient Near East mourned him for centuries. For generation after generation, people in Mesopotamia held rituals for Dumuzi. Women wept in the streets, chanting laments about the lost shepherd. Priests recited liturgies describing his descent, his suffering, his absence from the fields. The land itself was imagined as grieving. No flocks on the hills, no grain in the storehouses, no joy in the villages. His death became seasonal. Every year, when the heat of summer scorched the pastures and withered the vegetation, people remembered Dumuzi's descent into the underworld. When the rains returned and the fields grew green again, they spoke of his partial return, or of his continuing presence in the cycle of life and death. Dumuzi wasn't just a character in an old story. He was woven into time itself. Over and over, the rituals underline the same connection: shepherd, death, renewal, a divine or semi-divine figure tied to flocks and fields, a violent, untimely death, a community that survives through mourning, remembering, and reenacting that death in ritual. It's hard not to think of later traditions when you read these lines, of other shepherds described as slain, other figures whose blood somehow brings renewal, whose death is treated as sacred sacrifice rather than meaningless loss. And this is where Dumuzi and Abel quietly touch. Abel too is a shepherd whose offering seems to find divine favour, and he too dies violently, out in the open land, his blood soaking the ground. In Genesis, God says Abel's blood cries from the earth, as if the very soil remembers. In Sumer, the earth remembers Dumuzi as well. His death is tied to the fertility of the land, to the return of crops and the health of animals. Different cultures, different gods, different theologies, but the same haunting idea. The life of the community somehow depends on the suffering of the innocent. A shepherd killed, a death that is both tragedy and turning point. Scholars debate how far these parallels really go. Some argue that the Dumuzi cycle is about vegetation and seasonal change, not ethics and sin. Others point out that Cain and Abel is a moral tale, centered on jealousy, anger, and divine warning. The Sumerian myths, they say, are about cosmic order and the balance between worlds. That might be true, and yet at a deeper level, both traditions seem obsessed with the same knot of themes: death, sacrifice, divine favour, and the strange recurring link between shepherds and sacred blood. Why shepherds? Maybe because in the earlier cities shepherds stood at a crossroads. They moved between settled fields and wild pastures, between walls and wilderness. They lived close to death, of animals, of predators, of hunger and drought. They carried the responsibility of feeding the community, of turning fragile living creatures into meat, wool, and sacrifice. In myth, that position becomes symbolic. The shepherd is the one closest to life and death, the one whose work constantly brushes against the boundary between them. When a story needs someone to die in a way that reshapes the world, it often chooses a shepherd. Dumuzi dies, and the fertility cycle is sealed to his name. Abel dies, and the biblical narrative pivots from idyllic beginnings to exile, cities, and flood. In both cases, once the shepherd's blood touches the ground, there is no going back to how things were. Did the story of Dumuzi's murder and descent directly inspire the biblical authors when they wrote about Cain and Abel? We don't know. The evidence is suggestive but not decisive. The time gap is vast. The lines of transmission are tangled. But we can say this. Long before Genesis was written, people in Mesopotamia were already telling stories about a beloved shepherd, chosen by a powerful goddess, betrayed, hunted and dragged down to the underworld. They were already weeping for him in ritual, already linking his death to the turning of seasons, the health of the flock and the fate of the land. By the time scribes in ancient Israel shaped the tale of Cain and Abel, the region had been saturated with these patterns for thousands of years. Brother against brother, shepherd slain, blood and soil and divine response, death and sacrifice intertwined like threads in an old, fraying tapestry. The question is not whether echoes exist. The question is how loudly we're willing to hear them. Names in the ancient Near East were never just labels. They were miniature stories, compact little spells. A name could record a prayer, a profession, a family hope, even a quiet complaint against the gods. To understand Cain and Abel, we have to start with this idea. Their names weren't chosen at random, they were messages. And those messages might be far older than the biblical text that preserves them. In the Hebrew Bible, Cain appears as Cain and Abel as HEVEL. On the surface, simple enough. But once you start pulling on those syllables, they unravel into something strange, something that looks out across the desert towards Sumer. The text of Genesis itself gives us the first hint. When Eve gives birth to her first son, she says, "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." The Hebrew verb for acquired is kaniti. Cain, looks like it's built from that same root. QNH, to get, to acquire, to possess. On this reading, Cain is the acquired one, the child longed for, the son obtained, perhaps the first great hope of humanity after expulsion from Eden. On the face of it, that seems neat and tidy. The name matches the pun, case closed. But ancient names are rarely that polite. They often sit on multiple meanings at once. And when we look beyond Hebrew, into older languages of Mesopotamia, that neat little pun starts to look more like a surface layer, a later explanation painted over something deeper. Some scholars have suggested that behind Cain there may be an older term, something like ka.in or ga.in, filtered through centuries of retelling. In Sumerian, ka can mean mouth, speech, or soul, but in compound forms it appears connected with crafts, tools, and skills. Other proposed roots point toward words linked with metalworking and smithing in neighbouring Semitic languages, where a similar-sounding term can mean smith or metalworker. Put simply, there are two major possibilities that keep coming up in the literature. Cain as the acquired one, Cain as the smith, the maker, the worker of metal. Both readings fit surprisingly well with the role Cain plays in later traditions. In some post-biblical stories, Cain and his descendants are associated with the first tools, the first cities, even the first weapons. Metal, technology, and violence all braided together. If the name does echo an older Sumerian or Mesopotamian term, it might preserve a memory of a time when the figure we call Cain was not just a farmer, but a culture hero of craftsmanship, someone who acquired knowledge from the gods or from forbidden places and brought it back to humans in the form of tools, a blessing that could easily become a curse. We can't prove that. The etymology is slippery. The tablets we still have are only a fraction of what once existed. But the overlapping hints, acquisition, craftsmanship, possible smithing, suggest that Cain's name may have always carried the tension between gift and danger, between human skill and human overreach. Abel's name, at first glance, seems easier. In Hebrew, HEVEL simply means breath, vapor, mist, something that vanishes almost as soon as it appears. Later in the Bible, the same word is used in Ecclesiastes, where the writer sighs that all is HEVEL. All is fleeting, insubstantial, like a puff of breath on a cold morning. If you were inventing a name for a character who lives briefly and dies young, HEVEL would be almost too perfect. His life is a mist. His story disappears in a few verses. His blood cries out, and then nothing. The text moves on, but once again, when you place that name next to Sumer, the edges start to blur. Some researchers have wondered whether HEVEL might echo older Sumerian concepts of breath as life force, or as the fragile animating principle that the gods could give and take away at will. The Sumerians had words like Zi for life, breath, spirit, and Nam for fate, destiny. While HEVEL isn't a direct match to any specific Sumerian term, the idea it carries, the sheer fragile shortness of life, was central to Mesopotamian thinking. Is there a direct linguistic borrowing here? Probably not in a simple one-to-one way. HEVEL is firmly at home in Hebrew. But the metaphor it embodies, life as a breath, life as a puff of vapour, is part of the same mental world that produced the Sumerian laments, the mourning songs for shepherd gods and doomed kings. It's possible that what we're seeing is not a lone word, but a shared poetic language, different tongues, similar metaphors, people living in the same broad cultural zone, watching the same short lives end too soon, reaching for the same imagery to express it. Still, the pairing is haunting. One brother whose name may whisper of acquisition, craft, possession. Another whose name is nothing but breath. In a culture where names hold meaning, this contrast might be the key to the entire story. Cain, the acquired or crafting figure, rooted in the earth, building, controlling, shaping. Abel, the breath, the vapour that cannot be owned, the life that slips away. One associated with permanence, fields, walls, tools. The other with impermanence, flocks that wander, life that ends, smoke rising from a pleasing sacrifice and disappearing into the sky. Seen this way, the narrative isn't just about jealousy and murder. It becomes a meditation on what humans try to hold on to and what they inevitably lose. On the tension between the impulse to possess and the reality that everything, in the end, is HEVEL. Scholars argue about how far we can push these connections. Some are cautious, insisting that Cain is best understood purely within Hebrew, as a clever pun from a later editor. Others are more adventurous, pointing to a web of parallels between Sumerian shepherd-farmer tales and the Genesis story, and suggesting that the names carry at least the echo of older Mesopotamian roles and titles. Direct borrowing or parallel development? Ancient scribes consciously adapting Sumerian patterns or simply breathing the same cultural air and dreaming similar stories? We don't know. And this uncertainty is part of what makes the names of Cain and Abel so compelling. They sit right on the fault line between what can be documented and what can only be guessed. When you whisper Cain and HEVEL, you're speaking words that may have passed through dozens of languages and hundreds of retellings. Their meanings have probably shifted, layered, cracked, and been patched over with folk etymologies more than once. Yet something of the original charge still seems to be there. Possession and loss, craft and breath, weight and vapour. Maybe the earliest tellers of this story were already playing with these resonances. Maybe a Sumerian audience once heard a similar pair of names, one heavy, one light, and knew instantly what kind of tragedy was coming. Or maybe those patterns arose later, in Hebrew, as scribes and poets tried to compress an entire world view into two short, unforgettable names. Either way, the names themselves become part of the mystery. Tiny linguistic fossils pressed into the text. We can see their outlines clearly. We can guess at the living creatures they once belonged to. But the full shape, the full colour, the full sound of the original story, that remains just out of reach, like a breath on the air, already fading as we try to grasp it. The story of Cain and Abel doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits inside a much larger tapestry of stories, a web of myths that ancient peoples told about beginnings and endings, about gods and humans, about the moments when everything almost ended and somehow continued. And one of the clearest threads in that web is the story of a great flood. Long before anyone wrote the book of Genesis, scribes in southern Mesopotamia were pressing wedge-shaped signs into wet clay, recording a story about a man who survives a world-destroying deluge. The oldest version we know by name is Ziusudra, the pious king from the Sumerian flood story. Later, the Akkadians would call him Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. Still later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he appears as Utnapishtim, the man who found a way to live forever. The details shift with each retelling, but the basic pattern is remarkably stable. The gods become angry or disturbed by humanity. Sometimes people are too noisy, disturbing the sleep of the gods. Sometimes they have multiplied too much, consuming resources, upsetting the cosmic balance. A decision is made, a flood will wipe the slate clean. But one man is warned. In the Sumerian Yasudra tale, he receives a divine message through a wall or a dream. In Atrahasis, the god Enki, or Ea in Akkadian, secretly instructs the chosen human to tear down his house and build a great boat. He's told to bring his family, skilled workers, animals, the seeds of life. The flood comes. It lasts many days. The boat rides out the storm. At last the waters recede. The survivor tests the land by releasing birds. When they don't return, he knows dry land is near. Afterward there is a sacrifice, a pleasing aroma, gods regretting the devastation, a covenant of sorts so that such a total destruction will not happen again. When you read the story of Noah with these earlier texts in mind, it doesn't feel like a coincidence. It feels like you're seeing a familiar story in a different language. Noah is warned by God about a coming flood. He's told to build an ark, to bring his family and animals 2 by 2 or in 7s, depending on which biblical strand you read. The rains fall for many days. The waters cover the earth. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove. The dove returns with an olive leaf, then doesn't return at all. Noah steps out onto dry ground, offers a sacrifice. God smells the pleasing aroma, promises never again to destroy all life with a flood, and sets a sign in the sky. The parallels aren't just poetic, they're structural, specific, and for most scholars of the ancient Near East they're not controversial. The consensus is that the biblical flood story was shaped in an environment already saturated with Mesopotamian flood traditions. Israelite scribes didn't invent the idea of a world-destroying deluge out of nothing. They were participating in a long-running conversation, taking an older pattern and adapting it to their own theology, their own vision of a single, just and moral God. The trail is fairly clear. We have Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian flood texts that predate the Hebrew Bible by centuries, sometimes more than a millennium. We know that during the Babylonian exile, Judean elites were exposed directly to Mesopotamian literature. We know that cuneiform texts were being copied and studied in scribble schools in the very cities where exiled Israelites lived. It doesn't take a wild imagination to picture a Judean scribe hearing the story of Atrahasis or Gilgamesh and recognizing something powerful in it, then reworking it within the framework of Israel's own covenant story. Once you accept that, something interesting happens. The flood becomes a precedent. If an iconic biblical story like Noah's Ark can grow out of, or at least be deeply shaped by, older Mesopotamian material, then it becomes reasonable to look at other biblical stories and ask whether similar patterns might be at work. Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, even elements of the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. Are these two standing on Sumerian or Akkadian foundations? With the flood, the line from Sumerian's Yasudra to Akkadian Atrahasis to Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh to Noah in Genesis looks like a chain. You can watch specific ideas move from one link to the next. The secret warning, the boat, the birds, the sacrifice, the divine regret. It's not a straight, clean line, but it's a recognizable path. The Cain and Abel connection is more like looking at shadows on the wall. We can see that the Sumerians already had stories about rival brothers or rival professions, the farmer and the shepherd, the one beloved of a goddess, the one less favoured. We can see that they already told stories about a world-resetting flood, about divine judgment, about a humanity that needed to be restarted. And we know that, centuries later, Israelite authors were building Genesis in a world that had inherited all of those patterns. But here the evidence is thinner, more tangled. With Cain and Abel, we don't have a cuneiform tablet that says, This is the original version of the story you're about to read in the Bible. We have parallel motifs scattered across myths and hymns and ritual texts. We have names that sound suspiciously similar. We have occupational rivalries, divine preference, anger, violence, exile. We have intriguing puzzle pieces, but not the instruction manual that shows exactly how they fit together. This is why scholars tend to speak more cautiously about Cain and Abel than they do about Noah. With the flood, Mesopotamian influence on Genesis is a textbook example. With Cain and Abel, it's a live debate. Some argue that the parallels are too strong to ignore, that the biblical authors were reworking Mesopotamian themes of farmer versus shepherd, divine choice, and human violence in light of Israel's own concerns about sacrifice, land, and covenant. Others insist that stories about brothers in conflict and offerings to the gods could arise independently in many cultures. After all, farming and herding are universal human experiences. So are jealousy and violence. Instead of a single pipeline of influence, we should imagine a dense network. A web of mythology stretched from Sumer and Akkad down the centuries, carried by merchants and soldiers, captives and migrants, scribes and storytellers. People moved, languages mixed, empires rose and fell. With each conquest and collapse, myths were traded, merged, and reshaped. A story told in a Sumerian temple could be retold in Akkadian around a palace hearth, then adapted in Hurrian, then heard in a Canaanite port, then finally written down in Hebrew with new names, new theology, but an old familiar skeleton underneath. Not as plagiarism, but as what humans have always done, recycling meaningful patterns, updating them for new times and new questions. The flood myths show us that this process really happened. They are our clearest window into the mechanism of story travel in the ancient world. Once you recognize the Mesopotamian flood behind Noah, it's like turning on a dim lamp in a dark room. Suddenly you can just make out other shapes, other forms, flickering in the shadows. The Cain and Abel story might be one of those shapes, or it might be an independent creation that simply inhabits the same mental universe. A world where gods choose some and not others, where land and food and sacrifice are charged with cosmic meaning, where human blood once spilled cries out from the ground. What we can say is that Genesis didn't appear on a blank slate. It emerged in a world already rich with stories of creation and destruction, floods and gardens, kings and shepherds, farmers and gods. The Sumerian tablets give us an earlier layer of that world. They let us watch some of the patterns forming long before the biblical author set chisel to stone or pen to parchment. By tracing the flood from Zeusudra to Noah, we're not just comparing two stories. We're learning how ancient ideas moved, how they survived conquests, language shifts, and cultural upheavals. We're watching the slow, quiet journey of myths across centuries, and that journey is the context in which any possible connection between Cain and Abel and Sumerian tradition has to be understood, not as a simple copy and paste, but as one episode in a long, intricate history of stories flowing through time like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic, always reshaping the landscape of human imagination. For ancient listeners, the idea of a farmer and a shepherd arguing over a goddess or over God's favour wasn't just a nice little story. It was the story. It was the tension that shaped their entire world. Because by the time Sumerian scribes were pressing cuneiform signs into wet clay, humanity had already crossed one of the most dramatic thresholds in our history. For hundreds of thousands of years your ancestors lived as mobile foragers and hunters, following herds, tracking seasons, moving when resources ran out. Then, very slowly, in a few river valleys, something new appeared. People started to stay put. They planted seeds in the spring, harvested in the autumn, and watched the sky with a different kind of anxiety. Instead of asking, where will we move next? They began to ask, will the floods come on time? Will the barley ripen before the heat scorches it? This was the birth of agriculture, and right beside it, rising in parallel, was pastoralism. Instead of sowing fields, some groups invested in herds, sheep, goats, cattle, animals that could convert rough grass into meat, milk, wool, and hides. Animals that could walk on their own 4 legs to new pastures when old ones were exhausted. So now, imagine 2 families. One lives in a reed house on the edge of an irrigation canal. Every day they check the water level, pull weeds, repair dikes, chase birds away from the young shoots. Their wealth is literally rooted in the ground. If someone tramples their field, if a canal is blocked, if the river fails to flood, their entire year is ruined. The other family ranges with their flocks. They read the landscape like a book. They know which hillsides stay green the longest, which streams last into the dry season. Their wealth has legs. If one area fails, they move. But their animals are hungry, and the best grass is often near the carefully irrigated fields of the farmers. You can already feel the friction. The farmer sees the shepherd as a threat. Trampling hooves, grazing mouths, chaos spilling into a carefully ordered landscape. The shepherd sees the farmer as an obstacle, claiming the best land, fencing off water, insisting that the earth stays still when the world has always been in motion. In Mesopotamia, this wasn't theoretical. It was an existential conflict. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is generous, but it is not easy. Rainfall is unreliable. The good soil lies in floodplains that can be drowned by sudden surges or left parched by fickle rivers. To farm here, you need organization, canals, levees, walls, agreements about who gets water first, rules about when sluice gates open and close. In other words, you need a settled, cooperative, sometimes rigid society. Pastoralists, on the other hand, need flexibility. They need to be able to move herds along riverbanks, across fallow fields, up into steppes and down into valleys. They thrive on mobility, on negotiation, on short-term access rather than permanent ownership. When you put these 2 survival strategies next to each other, in a crowded, fragile river valley, conflict isn't just possible, it's almost guaranteed. We actually see traces of this in the historical record. Later Mesopotamian law codes, like the laws of Eshnunna and Hammurabi's famous stele, include careful regulations about what happens if animals eat a neighbor's crops, if someone leads a herd through a field, if an irrigation canal floods another man's land. These aren't abstract legal puzzles. They're the fossilized remains of real arguments, real fights, probably real blood. Archaeologists find evidence of fortified villages on the edges of good farmland, and texts talk about Martu, or Amorite peoples, often described as tent dwellers, sheep raisers, wandering groups who pressed against the boundaries of settled city-states. The scribes, usually writing from the perspective of those city-states, portray these groups as troublesome, uncivilized, sometimes dangerous. But they were also indispensable suppliers of wool, meat, and animals for sacrifice. So the relationship was love-hate, dependence and resentment wrapped together, and mythology became the place where this complicated reality could be explored, safely, symbolically. In the Sumerian poems about Dumuzi the shepherd and Enkimdu the farmer, we're not just watching 2 men compete for Inanna's affection. We're watching 2 ways of life make their case before the divine. The farmer boasts of stable grain, secure storehouses, orderly canals. The shepherd boasts of rich cream, warm wool, the ability to bring gifts from distant pastures. Each one claims to be more valuable to the goddess, more worthy of her attention. This isn't just romantic drama. It's a poetic debate over which economic system should stand at the centre of society. Should the gods favour the ploughed field or the open range, the granary or the flock? Hebrew listeners centuries later were living with their own version of this tension. The early Israelites emerged in a landscape where pastoralism was still incredibly important. The Bible remembers its ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as herdsmen, moving their flocks, digging wells, negotiating grazing rights almost exactly the way pastoralists had for thousands of years. But at the same time, these stories were edited and retold by people who knew cities, who knew kings, who knew the weight of stored grain and temple offerings. So when the book of Genesis introduces Cain the farmer and Abel the shepherd, it taps into the same deep fault line that Sumerian myths had already mapped out. The field versus the flock, the altar piled with grain versus the altar red with animal fat, the settled life versus the wandering one. In both traditions, the conflict is framed as a question of divine favour. Which offering does the deity prefer? Whose way of life does heaven smile upon? And beneath that question lies another more anxious one. Whose way of life will survive? Because historically, this wasn't just a matter of personal taste. The spread of agriculture fundamentally changed the balance of power. Fields can support higher population densities than pastures. Walled towns can field armies and build temples. Over time, farmers tend to turn into city dwellers, and city dwellers tend to write the histories. In those histories, the shepherd is often cast as the outsider, the stranger, the one just beyond the walls. But memory is stubborn. Even as cities rose in Mesopotamia and in the Levant, people remembered the older ways. They remembered following flocks under the stars. They remembered seasons when herding had been the main strategy, the safer bet. That nostalgia surfaces in surprising places, in kings who boast of being shepherds of their people, in gods who are described as leading their followers like flocks, in psalms that say, "The Lord is my shepherd." So mythology did something subtle and powerful. It encoded the conflict between farmer and shepherd, but it also tried to reconcile it. Dumuzi, the shepherd, becomes the beloved of Inanna, but he also becomes a symbol of seasonal death and rebirth, tied to agricultural cycles. Cain, the farmer, becomes a warning about violence, but shepherds later become heroes and kings in the same Hebrew tradition. Underneath it all is a historical reality. Humanity was moving from mobile herding and foraging toward permanent fields, permanent cities, permanent states. That transition didn't happen in a single generation. It unfolded over millennia, one small choice at a time. A village digging a deeper canal, a clan opting to fence a meadow instead of moving on, a family deciding to plant barley instead of relying on wild stands. Each of those choices had winners and losers. Each stirred up tensions that could turn deadly. And so the stories emerged. Dumuzi and Enkimdu in Sumerian, Cain and Abel in Hebrew. Tales where a shepherd and a farmer stand in for something much larger than themselves. Tales where a private quarrel mirrors an entire civilization learning, painfully, what it means to settle down. When we listen to these myths today, we're hearing more than ancient theology. We're hearing the echo of that long, uneven transformation. The murmur of disagreements over water, pasture, and grain, retold as divine disputes and tragic murders. The farmer and the shepherd are still there, facing each other across the field, each certain that their way of life is the one the gods must choose. In the biblical story, the trouble doesn't start with murder, it starts with a frown. God looks with favour on Abel's offering, but on Cain and his grain, we're told, God does not look with favour. No explanation, no rule book, no voice from heaven saying, "You brought the wrong thing." Just acceptance for one brother, rejection for the other, and a silence heavy enough to crack a human mind. For thousands of years, readers have tried to fill that silence. Was Cain's offering smaller? Was his heart impure? Did God secretly prefer meat over plants? The text doesn't say. It just leaves us with that raw, unsettling image. Two altars, two gifts, one wreathed in divine approval, the other ignored. One brother glowing under the gaze of heaven, the other standing outside it, staring in. To ancient people, this would have felt painfully familiar. Because long before Genesis was written, Sumerian scribes were already obsessed with a similar question. What makes the gods smile? What makes them turn away? In the Sumerian world, the gods were not abstract ideas. They were hungry, thirsty, particular. They had favourite foods, favourite scents, favourite kinds of worship. Temples were called houses for a reason. Statues were washed, clothed, fed. Sacrifices were not symbolic gestures. They were maintenance. If you didn't keep the gods satisfied, the world could unravel. So Sumerian myths spend a lot of time on proper offerings. In the story of Dumuzi the shepherd and Enkimdu the farmer, this isn't just a romantic competition for Inanna's affection. It's a question about which way of life aligns better with divine taste. Grain or flocks, fields or pasture lands. The slow, ordered growth of agriculture or the wandering unpredictability of herds. Enkimdu, the farmer, can offer bread, beer, irrigated fields, barns full of barley. Dumuzi, the shepherd, brings milk, cream, wool, lambs. Both are valuable, both are necessary. But again and again, especially in later tradition, it is Dumuzi who drifts upward toward godhood, Dumuzi who becomes beloved of the great goddess, Dumuzi whose death and partial return are woven into the cycle of vegetation and life. In that shift, some scholars hear an echo of Genesis. Abel, like Dumuzi, is the keeper of flocks. Cain, like Enkimdu, is the worker of the soil. One brings an offering from the ground. The other brings the firstlings of the flock with their fat portions, the parts most suitable for burning, most fragrant on the altar. And again, the pattern. The shepherd's gift is favoured. The farmer's is not. In the Mesopotamian temple world, offerings weren't all the same. Some pleased more than others. There were rules about what each god liked, which days demanded particular animals or particular grains, which combinations of incense and fat and flour would create the soothing aroma that delighted the divine senses. This wasn't random. It was a carefully maintained technology of favour. But there's a deeper layer. Across the ancient Near East, blood sacrifice carried a special weight. Slaughtered animals, especially valuable ones like the firstborn of a herd, represented life itself being handed over. Blood was life in liquid form. It stained the altars, soaked the earth, evaporated in the rising smoke. To offer it was to say, I am putting real life, real cost, on this stone before you. Grain offerings, by contrast, were more ambiguous. They could be rich, generous, sacred. They could also be ordinary, everyday food. In some cultures, blood seemed to reach a different register of divine attention, as if something about life poured out was more visible to the gods than life harvested in sheaves. So when Genesis tells us that Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions, it is hinting at a higher sacrificial voltage. Abel is giving up the animals that would secure his future. Cain, it merely says, brings some of the fruits of the ground. Maybe they were excellent. Maybe they weren't. The story doesn't tell us. But to an audience steeped in sacrificial logic, the implication would be there. Blood, firstborn, fat. This is premium. This is costly. Meanwhile, in Sumerian myth, Dumuzi is not just a shepherd. Over time he becomes a shepherd god, a divine figure whose very identity is tied to flocks, to fertility, to life that bleeds and multiplies. His association with Inanna gives him prestige. His death and descent to the underworld give him pathos. When he returns, partially seasonally, his cycle echoes the dying and rising of plants and animals, the delicate balance that keeps food, both grain and meat, flowing. Scholars who notice these parallels have proposed an intriguing possibility. Perhaps in some very ancient layer of tradition, pastoral sacrifice had a special sacredness. Perhaps communities who depended on flocks, or priests who oversaw animal offerings, shaped stories in ways that gently elevated the shepherd over the farmer, the altar dripping with blood over the one piled with grain. This is where theories about priestly agendas come in. Some researchers suggest that later editors of Genesis, priests who served in a temple system built around animal offerings, might have preserved or emphasized stories that put blood sacrifice in the spotlight. Not to demonize agriculture, but to underline a theological point. Life belongs to God, and life is most visibly surrendered in blood. Other scholars push back. They argue that the text is more about attitude than substance, that what mattered was not what Cain brought, but how he brought it. Still others say the story may preserve a dim memory of older conflicts between farming and herding societies, the friction between settled fields and wandering flocks, written now as a drama of offerings and emotions. What almost everyone agrees on is the emotional core, whether in Sumer or in Israel, whether addressed to Inanna or to Yahweh, the question is the same. How do you know when the divine is pleased with you? Ancient people watch the smoke of their sacrifices twist into the sky, just as we watch our hopes drift into the unknown, and they worried. Was it enough? Was it right? Was it seen? Sumerian hymns beg the gods not to turn their faces away. Laments describe temples abandoned, offerings ignored, prayers bouncing back in silence. The worst disaster wasn't a flood or a plague, it was divine indifference. To be unseen by the gods was to be already half dead. Cain's face falls when his offering is rejected. Hidden in that simple description is a whole universe of human fear. He has done the thing he thinks he's supposed to do. He has worked the soil, brought its produce, set it before God, and instead of approval, he gets ambiguity. No thunder, no curse, just a lack of favour. He's left to interpret the silence himself, and he does it in the most destructive way possible. The Sumerians knew that feeling. Their stories wrestle with gods who bless and withhold for reasons that are never fully explained. Crops fail after sacrifices. Storms smash cities that had been faithful for generations. Dumuzi, beloved of Inanna, is still seized and dragged to the underworld. Innocence does not guarantee safety. Devotion does not guarantee reward. In both traditions there is a quiet, haunting recognition. The cosmos is not a simple vending machine where you insert offerings and receive predictable blessings. The gods, or God, can appear selective, even unfair. One brother is chosen, one is not. One lover of the goddess is elevated, another is cast down. Sometimes the rain falls on the wrong field. Sometimes the smoke from the wrong altar seems to rise straighter. And yet, humans keep building altars. They keep bringing grain and lambs, bread and incense, prayers and promises. They keep telling stories about why some offerings work and others fail. Stories of Dumuzi and Enkimdu. Stories of Cain and Abel. Stories that, beneath all their ancient detail, whispered the same question we still ask in quieter language today. Am I acceptable? Am I seen? And if not, what have I done wrong? In the next part of this journey, we'll follow that question as it moves from Sumerian tablets into later cultures, carried along rivers and trade routes, reshaped by priests and poets, until a simple tale of two brothers becomes part of a vast web of stories, stretching from the Euphrates to the pages of the Bible. To understand how a Sumerian shepherd and farmer might echo in a Hebrew tale of Cain and Abel, you have to imagine something very simple and very human. Stories moving along the same paths as caravans. Legends riding on the backs of donkeys. theology tucked between jars of oil and bundles of wool. For most of their history, the people who had become Israel weren't living in a vacuum. They were camped right on the fringes of the great Mesopotamian world. To the northeast, the cities of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and later Assyria. To the southwest, Egypt. In between, a narrow land bridge where traders, soldiers, and diplomats passed constantly. If Mesopotamia was the hard drive of early civilization, the Levant was the cable everyone had to pass through. Long before the Bible was written, merchants were already carrying more than copper and grain. They carried rumours of distant kings, tales of gods who fought sea monsters, laments for dying shepherd gods, and love poetry about goddesses choosing between farmer and herdsman. These weren't just stories told once and forgotten. They were the pop culture of the ancient Near East, repeated around campfires and palace courts for centuries. We know this from the clay itself. Sumerian myths were copied and recopied into Akkadian. Old stories were translated into new languages, adapted to new gods, and adjusted to fit new political realities. By the time Israelites emerged as a distinct people, the Mesopotamian narrative landscape was already ancient. The flood, the sacred marriage, the dying god, the rival brothers. These motifs had been moving from city to city for longer than any one kingdom had survived. At first, Israel's contact with this world was indirect. Canaanite city-states traded with Mesopotamian powers, married off daughters, signed treaties. Along those diplomatic corridors, scribes carried tablets, models of law codes, lists of omens, bits of epic poetry. Local elites borrowed names, rituals, and ideas, the way people always do when they rub shoulders with a richer neighbour. Early Israel grew up in the shadow of these cultural giants, arguing with them, imitating them, and sometimes quietly absorbing them. Then came the moment that changed everything, the Babylonian exile. In the 6th century BCE, after a series of disastrous rebellions, Jerusalem fell to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The temple was destroyed. A large portion of the population, especially the educated and the elite, was taken east into the very heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. For generations, Israelite priests, scribes, and craftsmen lived among the canals and ziggurats their ancestors had only heard about. They walked streets where hymns to Inanna, Dumuzi, Enlil, and Marduk had been sung for 2,000 years. Imagine being an exiled priest in Babylon. Each day you pass monumental temples dedicated to gods you don't worship. You hear liturgies in a language you're learning to read. You see flood stories carved into stone, hear debates about divine justice older than your entire nation. It would be impossible not to compare, impossible not to respond. Exile didn't just break political independence, it opened a floodgate of cultural exposure. In that environment, the old Hebrew oral traditions met the deep archive of Mesopotamian myth. Some stories clashed, some resonated, some felt uncannily familiar. But it's important to remember, the Israelites didn't simply sit down and copy Sumerian tales. By the time of exile, those Sumerian stories were already ancient, filtered through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian lenses. They arrived not as fresh tablets from Uruk, but as long-lived narrative patterns. A god cut down and descending to the underworld, a shepherd beloved, a farmer contested, a great flood wiping the slate clean, an offering accepted, another rejected. These were themes that had been circulating for centuries, and Israel had its own traditions, stories about ancestors who wandered, about altars in lonely hills, about brothers who fought, reconciled, or never did. These had been passed down orally, told and retold through judges, kings, and prophets. Oral tradition is like a slow, persistent river. It keeps the rough shape of its course, but its banks shift, Its details erode and redeposit downstream. Every time a story is told, something changes. A name is updated to match current speech. A detail is added to make more sense to a new generation. A god becomes less anthropomorphic, more abstract. A local reference is dropped because no one remembers that hill anymore. But the emotional core remains. The feeling of injustice when a younger brother seems favoured. The terror of flood. The ache of exile. That's what survives. Over centuries, as Israel moved from tribal federation to kingdom, from kingdom to shattered remnant in foreign lands, these oral traditions hardened into written form, and here the scribe stepped in. Ancient scribes weren't neutral copy machines. They were editors, theologians, and sometimes quiet revolutionaries. They knew the surrounding myths. Many of them were trained in the same scribal techniques their Babylonian colleagues used. Cuneiform tablets and Hebrew scrolls existed in the same world of ink, stylus, and disciplined memory. When a Hebrew scribe wrote down a story that sounded faintly like an older Mesopotamian tale, they weren't hiding it. They were reframing it. Foreign myths could be used as scaffolding, but the theological architecture was different. Where Babylon might tell of gods squabbling over noisy humans, Israel's texts would insist on a single god acting with intention. Where Dumuzi is a shepherd lover chosen or rejected in a divine love triangle, the Hebrew narrative narrows the focus to two human brothers, one offering accepted, one not, under the gaze of one god. So what was preserved and what was changed? The broad frameworks often look familiar. Rival occupations, farmer and shepherd, divine favour and divine rejection, murder leading to exile, a land cursed, a wanderer marked. These may be old Mesopotamian patterns, absorbed through centuries of cultural contact, preserved because they speak to something deep and universal. The fear that the world is rigged, that some offerings, some lives, are mysteriously favoured while others are not. What changes in the Hebrew version is usually the direction of the theology. The gods of Sumer and Akkad inhabit a crowded competitive heaven. The God of Israel acts alone, personally engaging with humans, speaking, warning, questioning. The moral tension is sharper. Cain isn't just an unfortunate figure caught in divine politics. He's a person faced with a choice, explicitly told, sin is crouching at the door. Responsibility is pushed downward onto human shoulders. Elements that clash with Israelite identity tend to fade. Erotic, sacred marriage rituals vanish. The goddess as cosmic lover becomes a distant memory. The underworld bureaucracy of Sumer is stripped away. What remains is a stark landscape. Fields, flocks, an altar, a voice, and a brother's blood in the ground. Through it all, the stories remain alive. They aren't frozen museum pieces. They evolve with each generation that repeats them, each scribe that arranges them, each community that hears them and asks new questions. In that sense, the tale of Cain and Abel isn't a static artifact. It's a living branch on a very old tree whose roots reach back into Sumerian hymns, Babylonian rituals, and forgotten campfire debates along dusty trade routes. When you hear echoes between Dumuzi and Enkimdu and Cain and Abel, you're listening to that tree rustling. You're hearing millennia of transmission and transformation, the slow, patient work of cultures borrowing, arguing, and reshaping each other's stories. Not plagiarism, but conversation. Not certainty, but resonance. And somewhere in that resonance, under all the layers of language and theology, there may still be the faint outline of an older shared memory, of farmers and shepherds standing side by side, wondering which of them the gods would choose. By now the parallels are hard to ignore. A favoured shepherd, a rejected farmer, divine attention, divine refusal, jealousy, death, descent to the underworld, cosmic consequences. It feels like the Cain and Abel story has Sumerian fingerprints all over it. But not everyone agrees on what those fingerprints mean. Some scholars lean into the idea of direct influence. For them, the line runs almost straight. Sumerian stories like Dumuzi and Enkimdu are composed in the 3rd millennium BCE. Variants are copied and recopied in Sumerian and Akkadian for centuries. These texts circulate in scribal schools from Uruk to Nineveh. Semitic-speaking peoples live next door, trade, intermarry, share gods, share words. Over generations, motifs slip from cuneiform tablets into oral traditions. A shepherd and farmer rivalry in Sumer becomes a shepherd and farmer tragedy in an early Hebrew village. In this view, Cain and Abel aren't a brand new revelation. They're a refined adaptation, a late echo of songs first sung by Sumerian priests. This camp points to specific details: the pattern of divine favour, the idea that a god prefers one offering and rejects another, the connection to flood traditions, to exile, to cursed ground. Taken together, they argue, these resemblances are too precise, too structured to be pure coincidence. You don't need a conspiracy, they say. You just need time, trade routes, and storytellers who know how to reshape old tales for new audiences. Other scholars are more cautious. They see the similarities, but they're not convinced that the Bible's authors were consciously reworking Sumerian myths. For them, the story of Cain and Abel could be an example of parallel development. Two cultures wrestling with similar problems, reaching for similar images. Think about it. Early farmers everywhere worry about whether the gods will send rain, whether the soil will respond, whether their sacrifice will be accepted. Early herders everywhere live with the anxiety of flock disease, of raids, of wandering too far from water. Put these two lifestyles side by side, and conflict is almost inevitable. One ties you to a field, the other keeps you moving. One sees land as something to fence, the other as something to cross. You don't need tablets in Nippur to imagine jealousy between a field-bound farmer and a favoured herder. You just need a valley, two brothers, and not enough resources. This second group of scholars reminds us that humans are pattern makers. We love seeing connections. Sometimes we see too many. Shared elements might not prove direct borrowing. They might just show that Neolithic problems tended to produce Neolithic stories with familiar shapes. Between these two poles lies a third possibility, one that's harder to test but strangely compelling. The idea of a common source, now lost. Imagine very early stories, older than any surviving tablet shared in pre-literate communities across Mesopotamia and beyond. Tales of rival offerings, divine anger, murder, exile, and floods. Over centuries, as writing emerges in Sumer, one branch of these stories gets frozen into cuneiform, another branch stays oral, drifting with migrating clans, slowly changing languages, accents, details. By the time Israelite authors are composing Genesis, they may be drawing not from written Sumerian myths, but from a deeper reservoir of shared Near Eastern traditions, already reshaped 100 times. In this scenario, both the Sumerian Dumuzi cycle and the biblical Cain and Abel account are cousins. Not copies, not originals, but surviving branches of a much older storytelling tree whose trunk has vanished underground. The ancestors of the stories are gone, only their echoes remain. Then there are interpretations that step away from philology and archaeology altogether and look inward, into the human mind. Jungian thinkers, depth psychologists, those interested in archetypes, see Cain and Abel and Dumuzi and Enkimdu not just as historical puzzles, but as mirrors of psychological realities. From this angle, the details of Sumer versus Israel matter less than the pattern itself. Two siblings. One is favoured, one is rejected. One feels seen, blessed, chosen. The other feels invisible, passed over, ashamed. The tension explodes. Violence follows. For Jungians, this is the archetype of sibling rivalry, of the split self. The part of us that feels accepted fighting with the part that feels cast out. The shepherd and the farmer become symbols of competing life strategies inside every individual. Stability versus wandering, obedience versus rebellion, earth versus sky. Here, the repetition of the motif across cultures doesn't require direct borrowing or lost sources. It could be that human minds, when trying to express certain emotional patterns, naturally arrive at similar story shapes. Brothers, favor, rejection, blood. On the far edge of the debate, you find more controversial theories. These are the ideas that suggest not just influence, but suppression. Some argue that ancient Israelite editors knew older Mesopotamian myths all too well and deliberately reshaped or minimized them to assert a distinctive theology. In this view, traces of goddesses, dying and rising shepherds, and complex divine councils were shaved away, leaving a lean monotheistic narrative with most of its mythic scaffolding hidden beneath the surface. Others go further, suggesting that earlier versions of Genesis once contained clearer references to figures like Dumuzi, or more explicit flood connections, or even additional brothers and sisters now missing from the text. They point to odd gaps, abrupt transitions, names that appear and vanish, and wonder if we're looking at a heavily edited palimpsest rather than a single unified tale. The challenge with these theories is evidence. We don't have older Hebrew manuscripts of Genesis that show radically different Cain and Abel stories. We have hints, allusions, later interpretations, but not the original drafts. It's easy to imagine censored versions. It's harder to prove them. And that brings us to a crucial point. What do the tablets themselves actually tell us, and what do they leave in darkness? The Sumerian tablets can show us that stories about shepherds and farmers, divine favor and rejection, death and descent, was circulating long before the Bible was written. They can show us vocabulary overlaps, parallel images, shared mythic frameworks about floods, curses, and sacred fields. They can demonstrate that the ancient Near East was a tightly woven cultural fabric, not isolated threads. But the tablets cannot stand up and say, "I am the source of Genesis 4. They don't document who told what to whom, in which village, on which night. They don't record the moments when a wandering storyteller combined one older tale with another, or when a priest decided to emphasize one god and sideline another. They are snapshots, not a full movie. Between those snapshots, there are centuries of oral retellings we will never hear, entire libraries that crumbled, entire songs that were never written down at all. We can trace patterns, suggest paths of influence, sketch possible family trees of stories, but every step involves uncertainty. Every neat arrow we draw from Sumerian myth to biblical text passes through a fog of missing information. For some people, that uncertainty is frustrating. We want clear origins, clean lines, definite answers. Was Cain really Ka.in? Was Abel truly a distant memory of Dumuzi? Was there a proto-story told around a fire 5,000 years before anyone scratched a wedge into wet clay? We don't know, and we may never know. But uncertainty isn't a failure of historical inquiry. It's the landscape we move through, the space where questions stay open, where multiple possibilities can coexist without one crushing the others. In that space, Dumuzi and Cain, Enkimdu and Abel stand side by side as both related and independent, both borrowed and original, both historical and archetypal. When we read the tablets and the Bible together, we're not solving a simple puzzle with one correct answer. We're listening to a chorus of ancient voices, some clear, some faint, some overlapping so closely we can't tell who started the song. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the power lies not in pinning down a single origin, but in recognizing how deeply humans, across times and tongues, kept returning to the same questions. Why is one offering accepted and another refused? Why does one brother thrive while another falls? Why does violence erupt where love should be? The Sumerian tablets give us one set of answers. Genesis gives us another. The debates between scholars, the theories, the conjectures, these are just our modern way of joining that very old conversation. So where does all of this leave you? Lying there in the dark, listening to echoes from a world that vanished 5,000 years ago and more. Tonight, you've walked a very long road in a very short time. You started with a familiar story. 2 brothers, an offering, a rejection, a field stained with blood. The kind of tale that feels timeless, as if it has always belonged to your culture, your religion, your bookshelf. But trace that story backwards and the ground starts to shift under your feet. Suddenly you're not in ancient Israel anymore. You're in Sumer, among reed marshes and irrigation canals, among clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, among shepherd gods and grain goddesses and a young queen named Inanna choosing between a farmer and a shepherd who both want her favour. You watched as Dumuzi and Enkimdu argued over gifts and status. As the shepherd won the goddess, the farmer faded into the background, and then, later, in a different poem, the shepherd himself was hunted down, betrayed, dragged into the underworld. A web of rivalry, sacrifice, and divine preference that feels strangely familiar when you set it beside Cain and Abel. You followed names that look like shadows of other names, Ka.in and HEVEL. Words that may mean smith, possessor, breath, vapour. Words that might echo older Sumerian titles and roles, or might not. Linguistic footprints half erased by time, just clear enough to make you wonder, never clear enough to prove. You watched floodwaters rise and recede, washing stories from one culture to another. You saw the same skeleton of narrative appear in different places, gods choosing sides, one offering accepted, another refused, a brother lifted up, a brother cast down, blood crying from the earth. Over and over, the same pattern, dressed in different names and landscapes. And the humbling part is this. These stories were already old before the Bible put them into the form you know. Old before your language existed. Old before your ancestors knew what scripture even meant. They were passed mouth to ear in the dark by firelight, long before anyone pressed them into clay or inked them onto parchment. Why does it matter whether Cain and Abel has Sumerian roots? Not because it makes the biblical story less meaningful. If anything, it makes it deeper. It shows you that this isn't just the story of one religion or one people. It's part of a much older conversation humans have been having with themselves for thousands of years. A conversation about what happens when one person is chosen and another is not. About what it feels like when the work of your hands is rejected and your brother's is praised. About jealousy that turns into rage and rage that turns into something you can't take back. We keep telling versions of this story because the problem it describes never really goes away. Every time a younger sibling is favoured, every time a colleague is promoted, every time someone asks, "Why them and not me?" The ancient script stirs again, just under the surface of ordinary life. Maybe that's the real echo you've been hearing tonight. Not just the voices of Sumerian scribes or Hebrew storytellers, but the steady murmur of your own species trying to understand itself, trying to make sense of conflict, of guilt, of loss, of the terrible knowledge that you can love someone and still hurt them. We can't say with certainty that Cain and Abel grew directly from Dumuzi and Enkimdu, or from any one Sumerian tale. The evidence is suggestive, not decisive, a trail of clues, not a signed confession. But exploring that space between fact and possibility lets you see something important. Stories migrate. They transform. They carry bits of memory and meaning across centuries like seeds riding the wind. And there is still so much we don't know, so many broken tablets, missing lines, untold links between myths and histories. The past is full of rooms we haven't opened yet. If you'd like to keep wandering those corridors between archaeology and legend, between what we can prove and what we can only imagine, you're in the right place. If you found this journey soothing or thought-provoking or both, you can gently tap like, leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the archives of forgotten time. And if you feel like sharing, tell us where you're listening from tonight, which corner of the modern world these ancient voices are reaching. For now, let the names drift. Dumuzi, Enkimdu, Cain, Abel, Sumer, Akkad, Uruk, Eden. Thousands of years apart, yet somehow touching. Somewhere out there, under different stars, someone once lay awake listening to these same stories, wondering how much of them was true. You're part of that same unbroken chain now. Sleep well. And when you're ready, come back and we'll open another tablet together.